I had the bazooka. So let's go. Shot it. Try to hit the target, you know, hit the bunker. Pretty close, about 50 yards.
It would be called the Battle of Kwajalein. It was the first time Marvin Day, then a PFC in the United States Marine Corps, saw combat.
He only got scared once. He stayed scared all the time whenever he tried to disembark from that ship.
Marvin had boarded the USS DuPage 20 days earlier in San Diego. The transport arrived at its destination more than 5,000 miles away on January 31st. Marvin and his fellow 4th Division Marines were briefed on ship the evening before the landing.
They would explain, you know, like on board, what the island was like, where we were going in, and all those types of things.
It was called Roy Island, and the Japanese had spent 20 years building it up for war.
They had built these huge bunkers that were facing out at sea with like 20-foot thick, reinforced with steel, and our ships actually couldn't knock out all of those bunkers.
Each bunker housed twin cannons for destroying incoming ships. Machine guns protruded through the firing slits with a single purpose: killing American Marines before they could move up the beach. Marvin, still a teenager, had joined the military less than a year before. These bunkers would be his first combat objective. In the darkness of February 1st, 1944, Marvin left the relative safety of the DuPage with an advanced party of 100 Special Weapons Marines. The ship held 100 yards offshore, clear of the coral reef surrounding the atoll, while the Marines swam and waded the rest of the way, all while taking fire from the beach.
I was more interested in the sharks that you could look at over the side of the ship.
Working in 3-man teams, Marvin and the others hit the red sand of the beach.
We went in by dark, went in around, sort of crawling, climbing, and running. They made one mistake, was they had the guns all pointing out like this and this to see, or they had like a dead space in the back. Go in with flamethrowers and bazookas and hit them from the back.
Marvin carried the bazooka, a 4.5-foot tube capable of taking out armored tanks. His companions carried more of the rocket-propelled explosive charges it fired. Once behind the bunker, he sighted the weapon at the black maw of its open back and fired. They reloaded, and Marvin fired again and again. They moved up to the bunker, made sure it was clear, and moved on. When the bunkers were gone, they kept moving inland, returning fire as it came. The Marines secured the island's airfield, walked across a narrow causeway and through shallow water to Namur Island, and kept fighting. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lived in tunnels on the islands, and almost all of them would die there. 1 out of every 5 Marines in the main assault would be killed or wounded. Marvin was one of the other 4. Marvin Day was born in Pawnee, Kansas on February 29, 1924, to Guy and Lizzie Day.
They brought me when I was just a small child in Sulphur. I lived out west of Sulphur, about 3.5 miles on a farm, and I went to school in Sulphur. Robert Phillips and I, we were buddies, raised together, went to school together, did everything together. And we used to play around with old radios and things like that. And I got acquainted with electricity, how to, put a switch in, things like that.
Marvin and a small group of friends left school in the 10th grade to join the Civilian Conservation Corps, part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal.
They would go out and build springs and things for the farmers and plant sod, which is grass, and things for the farmers. They would fight forest fires.
The camp Marvin lived in, tasked with soil conservation, was in the mountains near Berryville, Arkansas.
The Army was getting $21 a month, and the CCC camp paid $30 a month. They'd send home $21 of that, and the other $9 was for laundry and different things. They give us little chips to, get sodas and things like that.
One Saturday, when the freezer stopped working, the camp's considerable food stores were at risk of spoiling because local electricians didn't want to travel on the weekend. Marvin's past electrical tinkering proved handy.
So anyway, I went up in the attic with a flashlight, and I found where one of the wires was burnt off, and I replaced that. Monday came around, they called me and they said, the commander wants to see you. He said, well, as of now, you're the camp electrician.
This new responsibility took Marvin out of the fields. Suddenly, his primary task was changing light bulbs. Then, in 1942, the CCC was shut down.
When the war broke out, then of course they needed the guys in the CCC campus for the military and things. So I came back here and I worked with my father. He ran a service station here in Sulphur.
Then on May 3rd, 1943, Marvin and friend Robert Phillips made the trip to Bentonville, Arkansas to enlist in the United States Marine Corps.
We were going to be little heroes or something like that. I wasn't drafted, but I was on the draft rolls. I had been notified that I was subject to be drafted. And so that's why, rather than being drafted, my friend and I, we decided to join the Marines because, you know, you could either join the Navy, the Marines, the Army, what branch of service you wanted to be in. And we decided that we wanted to be a Marine. And we thought that was the toughest or something.
They were trained at the 3rd Recruit Battalion in San Diego, California. Marvin's 3 years in the Civilian Conservation Corps quickly paid off. Early rising, ranks, uniforms, saluting, and other aspects of military discipline had been routine in the CCC.
They used to have inspections just like they did in the Army. They'd come in and flip a quarter on the bed to see if it would bounce. You had to make your bed so tight.
In mid-July, just 10 weeks and 1 day after he enlisted, Marvin achieved the rank of Private First Class. The Corps, however, also threw Marvin a curveball. When Marvin and Robert had enlisted, the recruiter had told them that after boot camp, they'd be sent to Chicago together, where their familiarity with electronics would be put to use. It was there that they were to be trained on a new technology vital to the war effort, known as radar. But when boot camp ended, Marvin discovered that his military life was to be determined by a paperwork mix-up.
They called us off. They called him to go to Chicago, to go to school to learn radar. Come to me, they said, you're going to 2nd Raid Battalion. I said, hey, you made a mistake. And they said, get over there in that line.
It was called Jacques Farm, or in the proper American fighting man pronunciation, Jack's Farm, though its official designation was Tank Battalion Training Center, Camp Elliott. A series of jungles within farmland taken from interned Japanese Americans, it was here that Marvin was trained as a Special Weapons Marine of the 2nd Raider Battalion, the elite of the elite. At Camp Pendleton, Marvin would finish his training on the intricacies of such killing machines as the bazooka, the flamethrower, and the Browning automatic rifle, though it would be a bazooka and a .30 caliber semi-automatic rifle that would keep him company in the field. It was sometime around this period that PFC Day had a public run-in with another member of the U.S. Armed Forces. At a train station, an Army lieutenant accosted him.
And I know he was just a 2nd lieutenant that got out of the officer's training school or something like that. But he stopped him. And he said, you know, it's a violation not to salute me.
Perhaps the newly minted officer didn't know that the two services had different rules for saluting. For example, Marines, unless on certain special duties, do not wear their covers, their word for hat, indoors. Marines do not salute when out of uniform, and a Marine without a cover is considered out of uniform. Therefore, under most circumstances, a Marine is trained not to salute when indoors.
And so they right away made me mad because I had did nothing wrong for him to do that. So he said to me, you're not saluting me, you're saluting my uniform. I said, if you're hanging on that post, I'll salute it.
Now, 7 decades later, Marvin attributes his response to the confidence of someone who had not yet seen combat.
We were tougher then. We were tough little Marines then. We thought we were.
After 2 months securing Roy and Namur in the Marshalls, Marvin boarded a ship for Camp Beaumont, an American military base in Hawaii. But it wasn't long before he was back at sea, en route to the next fight.
Each invasion, usually we were out at sea for at least 30 days aboard ship.
As might be expected from a young man raised on a farm, Marvin chafed at the confinement of sea.
I usually tried to stay on top deck. In fact, the Marines sometimes manned the guns on the ships. We would give the sailors a break, because, protect the ship against the aircraft.
But being above deck was not always possible. Whenever a submarine was suspected in the area, the Marines, whom the Navy considered cargo, would be locked down.
I just hated to be locked down when we had alerts from submarines. It's awful. You couldn't have any lights anywhere, You couldn't as much have a match to light a cigarette.
On the morning of June 15, the 4th Marine Division hit the barbed wire waiting for them on the beach of an island called Saipan. Under heavy Japanese artillery fire, which had already been zeroed in on the water just off the coast, the Navy coxswain steering Marvin's landing craft took the boat right onto the beach. Unable to get off, the coxswain disconnected the boat's machine gun and joined Marvin's unit in the foot mobile assault. By nightfall, the 4th Marines controlled 3 miles of coast in a strip just half a mile deep. The Japanese made a bloody counterattack under cover of darkness. It set the pattern for the next 3.5 weeks of fighting. When the darkness wasn't filled with all-out battle, there were infiltrators to deal with. Japanese would silently slip past American lines and use knives to kill and mutilate, trusting that the gruesome aftermath would strike fear come sunrise. Marvin was lucky. One morning he awoke to find his boots gone from under his cot, stolen in the night by a desperate enemy, but his throat was still intact. In the following months, Naval Construction Battalions, or Seabees, made Saipan and nearby Tinian the site of a massive building operation. In the field, Marvin and his fellow Marines typically ate canned rations that they supplemented with rice taken from Japanese encampments.
K-ration came in a can. You had a scrambled egg in this can. It was a can about 10 ounces, something like that for breakfast. Lunch, it was like a ham and, I don't know, some other kind of, like ham all chopped up in another can. And at night, it was a can of beans for dinner.
The Seabees, then, proved an opportunity for the weary Marines.
Honestly, we used to walk miles just to get to a CB camp because they would build mess tents and things, places to do the cooking and things like that. So we wanted to just go get what was left over to eat because after eating K-rations, you got pretty hungry. You didn't gain any weight. And they used to put us right at the head of the line. They gave us so much respect.
The Seabees had even constructed an improvised ice cream machine whose fruits they shared with Marvin and the other Marines. After a stint on Kauai, Marvin found himself steaming toward battle again, this time aboard LST-943. Less than 400 feet long, the LST was a specialized landing ship meant to push right onto the beach to offload tanks. LST-943 arrived off the coast of Okinawa on April 2, 1945, just one day after the battle known as the Typhoon of Steel had begun. Instead of being sent ashore right away, the Marines spent a week suffering seasickness aboard the flat-bottomed vessel.
Really a rough ride. I mean, it just bounced around all the time. The wave would come and the ship would go like this, right?
On the 8th, as Marvin walked ashore at Buckner Bay, he saw streams of kamikaze aircraft zooming overhead. Many were shot down, but others succeeded in their suicidal mission of crashing into American ships. Once Marvin was ashore, the battle would continue for 75 brutal days.
It was fierce. We took Hill 82. We were on one hill. It took us 30 days to take this one hill. It was all caves inside and things, and they were all in those caves, the Japs were and things. But the thing was, the Hill 82 went up huge, sort of like a mountain, and at the end of the mountain, it was down about 300 yards or something like that, down to the ocean. Or the natives were told so much that we would do so badly to them. The Japs had told them that the bad things we would all do to the girls and everything like that, and to them and things. We took that hill and they all went ahead of us on that hill, And they all jumped off by families and things. They just went up and jumped off by the thousands. In fact, we were chasing them up there a little bit. The Japanese was along with them. The worst things I saw was there.
It was the last battle in the Pacific, and it was the bloodiest, with more than 120,000 men killed and another 40,000 wounded. When the island's civilian natives weren't jumping off cliffs, they were all too often being shot down by U.S. servicemen before they could reach their lines. For the Marines, it was an act of self-defense. They had learned the hard way that many of the islanders were on a suicide mission, with live grenades clutched in their armpits or strapped to their backs. The Japanese soldiers who put them up to it were just as desperate. Products of a culture that saw shame in surrender, once out of ammunition they would charge into American guns with bayonets fixed. Those without rifles were given bamboo stalks to tie their knives to.
I mean, being a Marine, we didn't bother us getting rid of the ones that were in the war against us, because they were vicious people.
By June, when it was clear the island was lost, the Japanese were using indigenous people as human shields and frequently raping the women. Hostilities were briefly interrupted on June 3rd, when a typhoon swept across the island with winds too powerful for the Navy's equipment to record.
It was so fierce that it blew ships sometimes up 100 yards on shore. It blew away everything we had on shore. Our stacks of K rations and things, blew those away. You blow down, you couldn't stand. You blow you down, you had to crawl. I got into a cave. The typhoon lasted like for 2 days, but in the rain, just pouring rain, and I stayed in that cave until the ceiling started to come in a little bit. And so I crawled for, I don't know, several yards and got into a tomb and stayed in there for almost over a day.
Meanwhile, 8,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., talks were underway that would touch Marvin's life more than he knew. Since May, top military, political, and scientific personnel had been embroiled in discussion of how to use as yet theoretical atomic weapons. By mid-June, discussion centered around a list of targets chosen for maximum psychological impact. A month later, the concept was proven when a nuclear bomb was set off over New Mexico. Heading up the list of proposed targets was Kyoto. The first requirement was that a target have a packed civilian population at least 3 miles wide in each direction. Kyoto did this one better by also being the center of Japanese culture. But 77-year-old Secretary of War Henry Stimson insisted Kyoto not be bombed. He'd had his honeymoon there 52 years earlier and harbored fond memories of the city. It was a lucky decision. An atomic strike on Kyoto would have killed Japanese Emperor Hirohito. Considered a living god, he was the only man capable of making a surrender the Japanese military would abide by. The second target on the list was Hiroshima. On August 6, a B-29 named the Enola Gay took off from Tinian's North Field, the same air base whose construction Marvin had observed months earlier, with a payload of a single bomb. Mere hours later, Hiroshima as it had been known no longer existed. On the 9th, the Enola Gay again took to the air over Japan, this time scouting the next proposed target, Kokura. The crew radioed back that the skies were clear for the second atomic bomb strike, to be carried out by the Boxcar, another B-29. By the time Boxcar arrived, however, smoke was thick above the area, concealing the city. The day before, 221 B-29s had dropped incendiary bombs on the city of Yawata. With 16,000 pounds of bombs each, they had destroyed a fifth of the city in a blaze whose smoke had traveled the 300 miles necessary to obscure Kokura. Boxcar moved to a more visible city to drop its atomic bomb, destroying the metropolis of Nagasaki, including Japan's premier Christian community, active there since 1549. Both the Boxcar and the Enola Gay landed at a Seabees-constructed airfield on the recently secured island of Okinawa.
We knew that when that big plane came in, that something had happened. We were getting all ready to go invade in Japan, Marines were. But he came there because they had all kinds of people guarding that plane that landed there on the runway.
The B-29s had been on Okinawa for much of the day before scuttlebutt finally reached Marvin and the other Marines of what the mission had been. Celebration ensued, only to intensify over the next few days as it became clear that the Emperor intended an unconditional surrender. The wholesale invasion of the Japanese mainland had been averted.
When the guys found out that the war was over, I hid in a foxhole because everybody was shooting their flares, their guns, and everybody around. I've always said that was the most dangerous time of the war.
I received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration.
The surrender was officially signed on September 2nd, and on October 23rd, Marvin left Okinawa aboard the USS Meriwether, an attack transport that thankfully had nothing left to attack.
When the war was over, we got to go home by who had had the most time there, who had been in the most battles and things.
It was called the Advanced Service Rating Score, or more commonly, the point system. Men received 1 point for each month in service, another for each month overseas, and 5 points for each battle or other combat award. Those with a child under 18 got an additional 12 points. But Marvin's 67 points didn't guarantee an immediate reunion with family.
We wanted to just get home and get home, right? Well, that didn't happen to us. We had to go up near Camp Pendleton, and it's about 30 days for retraining to learn how to become a civilian, right?
Newspapers and magazines predicted a pandemic of violent crime as thousands of trained killers returned to the United States. No reliable statistics showed a higher incidence of violence among veterans, but the fears of the nation meant that crime stories featuring veterans were run front and center. As Bill Malden, the combat zone cartoonist who had shown civilians the war front through the lives of his creations, Willie and Joe, wrote later,
"An ordinary killing or assault seldom rated the front page, but if it involved a veteran or a battle fatigue case, it could be sure of prominent play. Every time an ex-soldier got himself in a jam, the fact that he was a vet was pointed out in the headline."
To stem the tide of the supposed crime wave, Marvin and others were sent to the classroom and retrained in civilian etiquette. Scuttlebutt said it was all because the First Lady felt they were vicious people.
We hated Eleanor Roosevelt because she thought that we were monsters or something, you know. We always heard it was Eleanor that had proposed that. Whether it was her or not, I don't know. I had no proof it was her.
Lessons included such insights as that it wasn't okay to stab a man on the street for insulting you. But not all of it was so patronizing. After months of male-only company and of the brutality of combat against the Japanese, some of the lessons were actually useful.
They just tell you that getting back into civil life after being in battle and all that stuff and things, you know, that it wasn't going to be easy, but it probably was a good thing.
There were some nice perks, too.
It was actually nice. It was beautiful because they had shows to come to us and things all the time out of Hollywood and things. They had the mess hall open 24 hours a day, and if you drank beer, if you were a drinker, they had beer you could have.
A civilian again, Marvin returned to Silver Springs and went to work. With thousands of servicemen returning, a severe housing shortage gave way to a building boom. Marvin was in on the ground floor, so to speak.
I worked for Clyde Oaks. He ran a hardwood flooring plant.
Together they repurposed barrel staves, originally cut to age whiskey in.
Clyde, he got Sibley Manufacturing Company out west of Sulphur to build machinery that he could take those barrel staves, and they were perfect because they had no knots in them. They were all white oak. You could run them through the mill, and it was perfect flooring.
For 4 years, Marvin drove Clyde's semi-truck, loading 6-foot staves in the hills, driving them back to be milled into flooring, and then delivering them for sale. But Marvin's civilian days were numbered.
I signed up in Kurt Seiler's service station. One day I brought my truck in having it serviced, and there was a recruiter there. He said, you know, you can go to Europe for 2 years if you would like. And he said, you can pick your choice of where you'd like to go. So I said, okay, I'd like to go to Germany.
His mother cried when he told her, but Europe's pull was too strong. Marvin entered the U.S. Army as a corporal. His wealth of experience in the Marines meant promotion would become a matter of routine in this, more upward mobile branch of the service.
They called me up one of the first days of when you had physical training. They called me, "Here, you're in charge of this." They kept giving me waivers, what they called waivers in time. I went right up to Master Sergeant and within 3 years in the Army or less, which is pretty much unheard of.
Originally promised a free trip to Europe for 2 years in the Army, Marvin found things weren't going to be quite that simple.
They changed the rules that I had to have 3 years to go.
Offered an honorable discharge and a train ticket back to Arkansas, Marvin signed on for the extra year instead. He would keep signing up for 3 years at a time before finally retiring in 1964. His Army service took him around the world. From 1953 to 1955, Marvin found himself back on the Pacific Rim. The Korean War had just ended, with the peninsula divided between South Korea and Communist North Korea along the 38th parallel. His title was Range Platoon Sergeant, Able Battery, 68th AAA Battalion, which consisted of 300 men and was the only American unit on the island of Womedho, just under 20 miles from the uneasy border.
We were there guarding against the North Koreans, and we were training the South Koreans, weaponry and things like that. That would be a soldier, good soldier. On the island out there was beautiful, other than it was cold. It was so cold, it was unreal. The winds would blow and they'd blow the seawater and that would freeze, and you'd get ice this thick.
After Korea, Marvin served on the U.S. East Coast in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Massachusetts, getting certification in biological and radiological warfare at Fort George G. Meade, Maryland. More than a decade after witnessing the tail end of the bombing mission that dropped the Fat Man bomb on Nagasaki, the second and, to date, last nuclear weapon used in anger, Marvin's Army career would be eerily tied to nukes, both defending against them and being ready to use them. A Master Sergeant with the 24th Artillery Group, Air Defense, from 1957 to 1962, Marvin surveyed radar sites for the Nike missile program, among other responsibilities. Marvin's contributions were so critical that he would be awarded his first Army Commendation Medal for them. Those early Nike missiles were essentially the first surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, designed to take out high-flying aircraft that might be sent to drop atomic bombs on the continental U.S. As the mainstay of our nuclear defense system, security at the Nike sites was paramount. That too was Marvin's job.
Operation Readiness and Evaluation, ORE team, I was in that. And I would pull raids on different sites at night to see whether they were maybe at 2 o'clock in the morning, see if they were combat ready.
Marvin had a helicopter assigned to him personally for the task, allowing him to swoop in for surprise attacks at any hour at these locations, whether on Long Island or in the Schuylkill Mountains. One other duty reflected on Marvin's training in the Corps, and on its doctrine. Every Marine a rifleman. Combat arms, it seemed, was just one of the areas where the USMC had insisted on a higher standard.
Oh, the Army was really a cruise.
With this disciplined background, Marvin was the perfect choice to coach the Defense Rifle Team, which he did, leading the team to numerous honors. But one of Marvin's proudest accomplishments would come in Germany, the very country he'd enlisted to see.
That was in 1962. That's when I got the Army Commendation Medal.
In April of '62, having been promoted to the newly created position of First Sergeant, Marvin was sent to whip a problem unit of the 38th Artillery into shape.
It used to be that the blacks had their own units, and back in '62 they implemented that we had to have a certain percentage of blacks in the white units.
All the way back in 1948, President Truman had issued Executive Order 9981, requiring racial integration of the armed forces, knowing that white Southern Democrats would stonewall any law to that effect if it went through Congress. Even so, progress was slow. It took 3 years for the Army to even announce its intention to abide by the order. By the early 60s, some units were handling desegregation better than others. Able Battery 2nd Gun Battalion, 38th Artillery, was not on the nice list.
They lived in beautiful German buildings that the Germans had, but then they would fight so much, it was just awful. They would knock all the windows out of the building, everything.
In addition to group beatings, African Americans in the unit could expect to find themselves sealed into wall lockers.
Before I took over, there was all kinds of court-martial given guys, and that wasn't working. Because they'd go ahead and fight anyway and things. But anyway, they put me in this unit. And I went there and observed it for like 2 weeks before I took over. They put me in charge of that, and I thought, boy, how am I ever going to straighten this mess out?
Marvin put them through an intensive physical training program while he considered its options.
One day I was doing that not long after I had taken over there, and I looked around behind me, and there stood a 3-star general. Boy, I'm in trouble. He said to me, "So what are we going to do about this mess?" I said to him, "Well, give me a chance."
His strategy boiled down to subjecting the men to the same canned foodstuffs he'd had to endure in the Pacific.
I took the whites and the blacks, and I took them out in the field for 30 days, and I had them live in pup tents, eat K rations, because in the barracks we had beautiful food in the barracks. Had them to eat, that's all I had to eat was K rations, and then they had to do their training out in the field.
The plan's final flourish took a bit of help from the general.
I said, while we're out in the field, get the Army engineers to fix up all the billets, sand the floors, put in new windows, put in a television, even though it was German. I said they would enjoy watching it, and he did that for me.
Then came the ultimatum. The men could shape up, behave like soldiers, and treat one another like human beings, or they could continue to live in tents and eat cold canned goods.
And it worked. They knew that no matter what, they were going to either get along or they were either going to stay out there in the woods for months. I spent the rest of the 2 years there, and I didn't have to give one what they called Article 15. It was a punishment that would go on their record. Truly, it worked well because some of the blacks then, they was as good on those guns as the whites.
The coup was such that it earned Marvin his Second Army Commendation Medal, which appeared as an oak leaf cluster affixed to the previous award. For the next 2 years, Marvin's unit would patrol the Czech-German border with a 280mm cannon in tow. Officially designated the M65, it was based on the Germans' Krupp 5 railway gun used in World War II.
It was redesigned where we'd put a tractor to pull it and a tractor to push it. We had to move every week. In fact, it was so heavy that sometimes the Autobahns would fall through and we'd have an awful time getting it out. They'd have 2 more tractors pulling it out.
The enormous gun was better known as Atomic Annie, and though crude compared to the Nike missiles Marvin had worked with in the States, she was capable of sending an atomic warhead almost 30 miles. And should the Soviets have sent an invasion force through Czechoslovakia, that was exactly what Marvin was supposed to do with it.
I spent 2 years in the woods because we had to move like every 7 days to a new position to keep the Russians from, of course they probably knew where we were at anyway, but, confuse them as to where we would be.
The atomic shells were almost a foot across and contained W9 warheads, each with a yield of 15 kilotons, equivalent to the bomb that decimated Hiroshima. Fortunately, only one was ever fired, at a Nevada test site in 1953. In October 1962, the world held its breath for 13 days after it was discovered that Soviet missiles were in Cuba, aimed at the United States. President John F. Kennedy blockaded the island, expecting military action. All-out nuclear war was averted when it was agreed the missiles would be dismantled, as would U.S. missiles in Turkey aimed at Moscow. Additionally, Kennedy agreed there would be no U.S. invasion of Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens.
It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the nation would still be reeling from it when Marvin transferred back to the States. The need for nuclear defenses had been driven home like never before.
Russia was supplying Cuba with atomic missiles. They could reach the whole eastern coast. In fact, they could hit any of the shipyards on the eastern coast that was building their ships and our submarines.
On the 14th of December, 1961, an improved Nike missile called the Zeus was launched at Kwajalein Atoll, the same islands Marvin had taken from the Japanese 18 years earlier.
I can talk about it now, I wasn't allowed to before. We also had anti-missile missiles. We had atomic missiles to knock out the Cuban missiles.
The Zeus passed within 100 feet of the missile it was launched to intercept, well within range for the Zeus-mounted atomic warhead to take out an incoming nuke.
We would pick up the incoming missile by radar, and then it guided our missile that we launched to intercept the missiles that were coming in. You can explode them right from the guidance system, or it'll automatically explode if it gets near enough to either missiles or aircraft.
In January 1963, the Department of Defense directed the Army to build the existing Nike missile system into an even more advanced intercept system called the Nike X. As part of this effort to protect mainland America from nuclear attack, Marvin was tasked with moving one such installation from Fort Banks, Massachusetts to Coventry, Rhode Island. He finalized the move on September 16, 1964. But Marvin's military days were drawing to a close. He was a family man now. While stationed in Pennsylvania years earlier, he had been near his young nieces. The only one in the family with a car, he'd take them to parks on his days off.
I spend all my free time with those kids.
And in the late 50s, a night out with childhood friend Robert Phillips had changed the course of Marvin's life. Robert's radar training in the Corps had served him well. He was running a Philco plant in Pennsylvania when Marvin was assigned to Philadelphia. They met for dinner, and at the restaurant, Robert saw a couple of women who worked at the plant. Minutes later, he was introducing Marvin to the woman who would become his wife. A one-time hairdresser, she married Marvin in 1953, later following him to Rhode Island and becoming a state senator for 17 years. But the Army was no place for husband and father. For his son's birth, Marvin was given only a 3-day deferment before being sent to Germany for a few years.
My daughter was 8 years later. She was born. Same thing happened. So I was away from my family quite a lot in the service.
After doing his part for the Nike X program, Marvin retired from the Army, now in his 40s. He settled in Rhode Island, took classes at night via the GI Bill, and went to work for Sears and Roebuck. Marvin's military service ended half a century ago, but the marks it left live on. Though Marvin's pride in his many contributions to his country has never faded, he has saved no mementos from his time in the Marine Corps.
I just want to be away from it all. You know, I want to start a new life. That was it. You never forget, but then it helps, I think, if you chuck all that stuff.
His wartime experiences especially are impossible to adequately explain to anyone who hasn't been there, let alone civilians.
I never talked to no one, not on them or anyone else, and things about my experiences, and I just never talked about it.
Then one night, while his daughter was in college, she cornered him to ask about combat.
She said, I think you owe it to me.
Today, Marvin says she chose a moment when he had a couple of beers under his belt, hoping they would help loosen his tongue. It worked.
So I told her, and then she wrote an article saying my father that I never knew, so I told her pretty much all the experiences I had going into the Marines and going to the battles.
Yet even that night, so long in the making, couldn't fully bridge the gulf between combat veteran and the loved ones who'd never been there.
I didn't tell her things like those ones that jumped off the cliff and things like that. I didn't tell her those types of things about the war. I told her some things that you had to go through, but not, I never explained, the bad parts about it, slaughtering people and things like that.
In a world whose popular culture alternately portrays warriors as glorious demigods or as caricatures of evil, few can begin to understand the toll taken on those who, like Marvin, we have sent into the teeth of combat.
You get feeling sorry sometimes or something, but you get flashbacks too sometimes. That happens. That even, you know, as old as I am, there are times that I think about things, right? You know, you do. It bothers you.
Today, if you ask him, Marvin will tell you two things. There's nothing glorious about war, and if heroes exist, he's never met one.
I haven't seen one yet. I did what I was trained to do. I certainly wasn't a hero. I was no hero.
Marvin, they sure do use some good words here. Initiative, knowledge, cooperation, devotion to duty, resourcefulness. I say they thought pretty highly of you. Don't see any Purple Hearts. You weren't wounded.
What? No,
You were one of the lucky ones.
we didn't. Well, there weren't too many Purple Hearts and Marines. It's a different thing altogether. In Marines, I was trained to fight battle, right? In the Army, there was different types, different things.
His outstanding achievement. Marvin Day reflects great credit on himself military. Master Sergeant Day entered the service from Sulphur Springs, Arkansas. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, somebody knew where he was from.